Welcome back, everyone, to the podcast. Super excited today to be talking to one of my heroes in the world of literacy and reading instruction, Jan Hasbrouck. Before we go over to Jan, who is sitting right in front of me now in Zoom land, I just wanted to mention that this podcast is sponsored by John Catt Educational, which publishes some of the best books in education, including my new book, Just Tell Them. It's all about the power of explanations and explicit teaching. And so I will post the links to John Catt's whole catalog, and you can take a look at all of their offerings and get yourself a copy of my new book, Just Tell Them. Jan, it's so great to see you. It's so great to finally have organized this because I've been wanting to have you on this podcast for a long time. How are you doing?
I'm great, Zach. Thank you for the invitation. This is going to be a fun conversation, I know.
You're from my area, which is kind of funny. We're both in the Seattle Tacoma area, Pacific Northwest, and so we're going to talk about that. We're also going to just be talking a little bit about a conference we're both going to later this year, which is the Nifty Direct Instruction Conference and Institutes in Eugene, Oregon. Tell me, like, you've been invited to keynote at this conference. What is your background with direct instruction?
My background with direct instruction goes way back. In fact, I just told this story as part of a keynote that I did very recently for the International Dyslexia Association. I had the opportunity to reflect about my connection with direct instruction. So I grew up in Eugene, Oregon. So I attended elementary school, middle school, junior high back then, high school. I knew I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to go into education. And I ended up, lucky me, at the University of Oregon, not because I did some thoughtful exploration of world-class universities. I ended up going there because the state of Oregon gave me a full scholarship because of my grades and my low-income parents. And so ended up at the University of Oregon and entered the traditional elementary education track. And like many, many, many decades now, generations of teachers, I became incredibly frustrated right away. Just like, when are they going to start teaching me about teaching? We're talking about it. We're doing all kinds of fun activities in classes. We're making collage boards and all kinds, but I need to know how to teach kids. I wasn't particularly thinking about reading, but just teaching. Like one of my classmates, it was a real important moment, pivotal moment for me, when she interrupted the teacher, the professor, and just said, "But how can I get them to come in from recess?" And I thought, bingo, it's the kind of thing we should be learning. And nobody was talking about it. So one day in my music theory class that we all had to take turns teaching each other lessons. I have no idea what my lesson was, but one of my classmates got up there and said, "I am going to teach you to recognize," and I think it was a chord, the chord of C, the C chord or whatever on the piano. And she said, so that's my objective. And this is a C chord. She played it and she said, "What is this?" And she said, "You're all going to say, this is a C chord. Wait, this is a C chord." And then she played something else. She said, "This is not a C. Is this a C? No, this is not a C." And on and on. She had a little 10-minute lesson or whatever it was. Afterward, I ran up to her and said, "What was that?" This was 1973. And I was 19 years old and wanting to be a teacher. And she looked like she knew what she was doing. And I asked her, "What was that?" And she said, "It's called direct instruction. And there are some trailers at the University of Oregon. The trailers are infamous back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and people were in those trailers. That's where Zig was and his very small team." And he said, "Go over and talk to Zig Engelman because he's recruiting students for an alternative track called direct instruction." So I probably put on my parka. It's probably raining, Eugene, Oregon. I went over there and found Zig and said, I want to do what you're doing. And what happened, the way that was structured, is he signed me up right away. I mean, he was taking any warm body because they were trying to, establish this training. And we went out to schools every day and taught in classrooms every single day for the morning. We taught DISTAR reading, DISTAR math, and DISTAR language. I was in a first grade classroom. And then we would come back in the afternoon and evening and take courses from Zig. Doug Carnine was there. He was a doctoral student though, and I was an undergrad. And so there really wasn't much of a team. There was Zig, and then we took behavior classes, classroom management, things like that from Wes Becker. And that was kind of it. Did that, then finished up my work and was invited by Zig to stay on to get a master's degree and join Project Follow Through. So took courses for my master's degree and traveled around the country to various Project Follow Through sites where they were implementing direct instruction, DISTAR at the time, and studying the effects of direct instruction on kids around the country.
That's incredible. And, if listeners have been following this podcast for a while, they may or may not know that there is an episode all about Project Follow Through from some of your colleagues, Linda Carnine and Susie Andrist, and Marcy Stein has an episode about her experience. We've kind of trying to celebrate everyone that was even touched the project, because not to be morbid or anything, but the numbers are dwindling, and it's kind of like, let's talk about it before the stories are gone, and that's incredible. So you've been invited to do a keynote at the conference. I've never been, but I'm doing an institute. And I'm going to do live interviews, maybe some little 15-minute kind of flavor of the day kind of interviews. I know it's early days to say what you're going to talk about, but you did recently do a keynote for the IDA, and called The Essential Role of Teachers for All of Us. Maybe speak to what you talked about in that keynote, and maybe some of that content we'll see it at the NIFTY conference.
Yeah, it's possible. Actually, Kurt Engelman was the person who invited me to do the keynote. And I mentioned that I had just done this keynote where his father, Zig, played a central role in my talk, because I started that. It was a 1-hour talk at the International Dyslexia Association. I talked about my becoming a teacher in a slightly expanded version of what I just told you, Zach. I wanted to be a teacher early on, and in my frustration and not being able to, not getting taught how to teach, and then finding Zig Engelman and being taught very systematically and explicitly how to teach using those incredible materials. So I will share that in a little expanded version, and then how we are all influenced by the teachers we have along the way. So I do talk about other teachers that I've encountered, and within the broader world, how we should honor teachers. And then I also touch a little bit on the science of reading, because teaching is a science. I love Madeline Hunter's discussion or description of teaching as it is science artfully applied. That's a perfect description of what teaching is. So I do talk in that talk a little bit about the science of reading and how it evolves. And that it needs to evolve. Zig knew a lot and gave us amazing guidance on this explicit systematic instruction, which has subsequently been validated by decades of research. But there are aspects of theories that we had 50, 60 years ago that have been proven to be less effective. And we as a profession need to, I believe strongly, embrace the science of reading, the challenge of that being that science is constantly changing and evolving, and we have to be ready to, and I quote Zig on that. He opened one of his books by giving credit to one of his teachers who said basically that idea, that if you've been taught something and you've used it and you believe it works, but then better evidence comes along and says, that's not what you should do, you need to let go of it, even if you believe it. I'm paraphrasing. He said it more eloquently, but that, I quote Zig again, on that idea that we have to be prepared to let go of our treasured, beloved things that we've done that seem to have worked when science says there's something even better.
And let's dig into that a little bit, because I am so interested in the science of reading movement right now. Because with the Emily Hanford podcast, that was the first time I saw in my career that folks that were not necessarily that engaged with sort of the broader educational landscape or research or history, all of a sudden these folks had listened to something. We all shared like a common a common piece of media that we could all refer to. But then now we're like in phase two of this. And so I'm curious, when you say like we need to understand that the science has evolved and there's new things to use and reference, what kind of things are you talking about?
One of the things is, and this was very pertinent, and I did mention it in my talk at IDA, a dyslexia conference. I mentioned in my talk, gave credit to and honored the founders of the International Dyslexia Association, who was Samuel Orton, who worked in collaboration with Beth Gillingham, and that their original theory which was brilliant and absolutely new idea, that these children who were bright or reasonably bright but struggled deeply to learn to read, that was not a medical issue, it was an instructional issue. They're the ones that figured that out. They also figured out that it was a language-based disorder, and they put together some instructional methodologies that really did seem to work with these children with dyslexia, that included things like what they called multisensory instruction. So for many decades, since the 1930s, that involved the OG, now it's called Orton-Gillingham methodologies, often involve having kids do air writing using large motoric system muscles, tracing tactile letters, sandpaper letters, or tracing words in rice trays or shaving cream or those kinds of things, along with systematically designed, explicitly taught reading. And the kids did really well. So just recently, some researchers collaborated to do a meta-analysis of what do we know about Orton-Gillingham methodologies. And they went back and looked at the studies on Orton-Gillingham and just published that last year, I believe, and said that there is no evidence that those multisensory methods contribute to the kids' learning. But if we separate those out from because clearly Orton-Gillingham methods work pretty well. They were what works, and what we know from a different line of research is that the systematically designed, explicitly delivered instruction is what works. And those other things were just added on. And we have to be careful about that, not only when we're working with children with dyslexia, but maybe especially for those children, is a time issue. If we take time to trace letters in sandpaper letters or shaving cream or whatever, they may be kind of interesting and intriguing to the kids, motivating. But it's time. Could we do some other things that would be better spending our time? And Jack Fletcher and Reed Lyon and Lynn Fuchs in their book talk about, instead of multisensory, do multimodality, because we do have evidence that when children see, hear, speak, and then motorically write letters and words and phrases, that does help the brain make those amazing connections between the visual code and the language code. So there are some strongly held, passionately held beliefs from OG people that they are, and some may continue to have difficulty letting go of those because they work. They work. The science is implying that those may not be what's working. So that's a big one. Yeah.
And it's so hard because it perhaps some of the original studies, like you said, it was an assessment of the entire evaluation of the entire program, and so
Definitely.
you couldn't tell which of the ingredients were active ingredients that led to the learning, and which of them, like if we use the toothpaste analogy, which of them are just glitter or flavoring and don't actually lead to student learning outcomes being enhanced. And so you as a teacher, you've done these multisensory approaches, and maybe along the way you get some confirmation bias. You see it click in one student just at the right moment, and you go, I've been doing this for so long. I swear this works. And you kind of, like you said, there are no sacred cows. We kind of have to be reflective throughout as the science evolves.
That's it. That's it. And it was just for me a real treasure to be able to find that quote from Zig where he said that. He himself, this genius who created this methodology out of whole cloth, from his belief system. I mean, it really came from his sense of, when I do this with kids, they learn better. And it was like in the moment kind of experimentation at first. But even he reminds us that we do have to pay attention to evidence and be ready to let go of things, even when our beliefs suggest otherwise.
I love that. It's a good reminder. And so the one area that you're really well known for on social media and the research world and the reading world is around fluency, like your emphasis on fluency. And I see we just had Christopher Such on. He talked about fluency as well, and Robin Cotting talking about fluency more in a behavioral perspective, but as it applies to math. So this podcast has kind of been obsessed with fluency lately. So I'm excited. I'm excited to hear your contributions. Can you share some effective strategies from your work that teachers can use to improve reading fluency in their classrooms?
I would be delighted to do that. I also spoke at the International Dyslexia Association on this topic. I was super honored to participate in a symposium that they have every year at IDA, where it's called the Sherman Symposium, and it brings together every year on different topics a scientist and a practitioner. And this year, the Sherman Symposium was on reading fluency. And the scientist was Dr. Marianne Wolf, who's done many different things, but a lot of her work is around achieving fluency. And then I presented what do we do about that in a practical world. So it is something I think about all the time, but very recently in a very formal way, presenting with Marianne. One of the things that I really emphasize, and a lot of my thinking on reading fluency, I always want to give credit to my colleague, Dr. Deb Glazer. Deb and I co-authored a book on reading fluency a few years ago. And so we did, a lot of work together and shaped each other's thinking. But of course, when Deb and I got ready to write that book, we looked at Marianne Wolf's work. And Marianne and her colleagues really help remind us that when we as practitioners talk about reading fluency, we're often talking, what we mean by that is passage reading fluency or text reading fluency. And that's a wonderful goal. That's where we want all our kids to be able to get. But we can use that term and should be using that term and should be thinking about fluency early on. Wolf and her colleague, Katsir Cohen, talk about fluency develops in progressions. We need to talk about developing fluency, which always starts with accuracy. We need to be thinking about accuracy and then automaticity at the letter level, the sound level, the word level, the phrase level. And then if we do all of that well, we may get to help our students get to passage reading fluency. So thinking about that, when Deb and I wrote our book, we recommend a mnemonic for teaching fluency across the development. When you're just in kindergarten, first grade, here's this letter, it says this sound, here's how you put it together with others. The mnemonic we created for across the whole bandwidth of fluency instruction is triple A. And the three A's are, giving credit to Wolf and Katsir Cohen, accuracy, automaticity, and accessing meaning. Because the whole purpose of reading fluency, and I always try to make this case too, fluency has no value and no importance at all in reading, except it's essential for comprehension. The reason we care about fluency is because of comprehension. We don't care about fluency all by itself. It has no value all by itself. We create it, we value it, we work on it, we teach it in service of comprehension. We know that for sure. Deb and I also added motivation on there, and that comes less from our looking at the research and more from both of us have been in this field for about 50 years. So our combined 100 years of working with children, that we have yet to find a student who struggles with fluency who's also a motivated reader. There's something there. I mean, just being fluent isn't going to make you motivated, but if you're not fluent, you're not going to be motivated. So comprehension and motivation is the purpose. The way you get there, teachers, is AAA. When you're working at the letter, the word, the phrase, the text level, make sure accuracy first. Take a piece of text that's appropriate difficulty for that student. Make sure, read it first with the students, the I do, we do, you do steps. But accuracy has to come first. What are those words and what do they mean? Because fluent reading is not reading without comprehension. So we go through the letters, the words, the phrases, the text first for accuracy. That might be more than once. Then we add rate in and build automaticity, because automaticity of word recognition, bringing in the expression and prosody aspect at the automaticity stage, and all the way through accessing meaning. What does that word mean? What does that phrase mean? Well, we just read something. The dog is big. Okay, let's stop and talk about that. What do we know? What do we read about? What don't we know? Let's get excited, turn the page, and find out more about this dog. So AAA is our structure for teaching fluency, starting at the very, very beginning when we're teaching letter names and letter sounds.
And you know what I notice, trying to do this spaced repetition for the listeners, is that how beautifully that maps onto the instructional hierarchy that has been talked here, right? Where the accuracy piece maps onto the acquisition. We move to fluency. Now we're looking at rate, right? And you're really only looking to generalize or adapt after a certain baseline has been achieved with accuracy and rate.
I mean, the frustration of teachers is we want to move up that instructional hierarchy as fast as we can. And we also know that some kids do it. But you can't skip a step. The accuracy is the foundation. First, foremost, and forever, accuracy is the foundation of fluency.
And one of the posts you did that sort of I'd say was semi-viral or so was there was like a screenshot of or a picture of one of your slides showing the predictive. How am I trying to say this? That fluency predicts comprehension much more than perhaps we are aware of. Yeah. Can maybe you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, I wish I had the citation right in my head, but I know it was Fuchs, Hosp, and Joe Jenkins, 2001, I believe, from the Scientific Study of Reading. Michelle Hosp is now a good friend of mine, third author on that. I believe she was a doctoral student at the time. But and she told me just recently that is the most cited article ever in the Scientific Study of Reading journal. But the premise of that study was looking at how a few informal assessments that teachers do in their classroom predict comprehension. That's the whole reason for reading. It's all about comprehension. But measuring comprehension is very difficult, very time consuming to do it right. So yeah, let's find some classroom assessments that can get close to at least predicting comprehension. So that's what that study was about. It was from fifth graders. The first thing that the researchers did was give them one of those multi-hour comprehensive assessments of comprehension so that they had a score. They knew what the kids' reading comprehension was in the way we measure it. Then they administered 4 different assessments. The one of them was a retell, read a passage and tell. They scored that and then correlated it with their true comprehension. And I believe that was 0.70 correlation, which is a strong correlation. And nobody should be surprised that retell correlates with comprehension, the ability to read a piece of text and then tell somebody with reasonable accuracy what was in that. And so in that study with those kids, it was 0.70. They also gave, the second assessment was a close, where there's a passage with missing words and the kids literally guess or predict what the word is. That correlated with comprehension at 0.72. Then the third one was read a passage and answer some multiple choice questions. And that did even better. That predicted the kids' comprehension, I believe, at 0.82, very strong. And again, nobody would be surprised at that because you read a passage, you answer some questions. That is kind of what we think of as comprehension. The last assessment in their report is the surprising one. They had these kids read an unpracticed, they've never seen it before, passage, 5th grade passage, read it aloud for all of 60 seconds. So they're administering a curriculum-based measure called oral reading fluency, following the standard protocols. Unpracticed passage, cold read, it's called, for 60 seconds. That's it. Score it for words read correctly per minute. They took that score from these 5th graders, correlated it to their comprehension score, and got a mind-boggling correlation of 0.92. That is probably why this article gets so much attention, because in the world of educational research, we don't see correlations in the 0.9s unless we're correlating inter-rater reliability or something like that. I mean, I have heard teachers leave my session and then later say, Jan Hasbrouck says that ORF predicts comprehension with 90% accuracy. Like, no, I did not say that. In this study, because there has been now about 45 years of studies kind of like that look at what ORF does tell us. And the predictions range generally from 0.7, 0.8, more often. That's the only one that I'm aware of that they get this astounding. But 0.7, 0.8, predicting comprehension for a 60-second assessment is by itself mind-boggling. And I use that study almost always when I'm trying to convince teachers to use the ORF, to embrace it. I empathize with teachers who are scoff, or administrators or whatever, who say, no, I'm not going to use a 60-second assessment where we don't even ask questions and the kids aren't familiar with the tech. No, that can't work. And I empathize with that because that's exactly where I was when I first heard about ORF. I remember where I was. I remember who told me. I remember the year. I don't remember the date, but I remember the year. And I remember sitting there thinking, no way. But that was 40 some years ago, 30 some years ago. And now I do believe it because I've done research with the ORF assessment. I've used it all the time in my practice with kids. So yeah, that's an astounding, amazing study. I'm glad we have it, but it's only one. There are more than 40 years now of studies that continue to show over and over and over young kids up until about 5th grade reading level. And it's really important to talk about that too, that it's the reading level. So we can use ORF with middle school and high school kids or adults as long as their reading level, and unfortunately, a lot of those kids' reading level is not solidly at the 5th grade level. After the 5th grade, fluency, or better, automaticity, is not as predictive of overall reading ability. It's best used in the earlier grades or the earlier stages of reading development.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, people might say, oh, hey, that 60-second, it seems like that would never work. There'd be some resistance. But this is coming from the same education system where people would do these Faunus and Pinnell assessments one-on-one with students that lasted with so many questions, and you couldn't predict anything, right? You couldn't, even the level that they were given wasn't even accurate, or you could even be confining kids to a set of books that they can't, that they don't necessarily need to be confined with to.
Now, Matt Burns did a study and said it's a coin flip. You can,
Yeah.
you can save a whole lot of money and just flip a coin and say, but it feels to reading teachers, it feels like it's telling you something real. The kids are reading real, authentic texts, and the questions, they're real, it just feels like it's a thorough, meaty, excellent, precise, because are they a C or are they a D? If it has a sense of precision about it, and that's really an excellent example of where teachers need to look at the science, and as painful as it may be, let go of a deeply held belief that seemed to work. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
did not.
Yeah, and I mean, even going as far as one school district I was at, that they were using a program in which the teachers were just meant to have over their shoulder conversations around their books. And then again, why can't we get rid of this? Because it's part of our values to talk to kids about reading, right? We want to show we're interested in what they're reading, but they're doing so much silent reading, and they're getting these random questions by the teachers. What could we be doing with that time instead?
Oh,
You know what I mean?
yes. Time. Always such a big issue. And definitely one of the reasons that direct instruction is so valuable when we can get teachers to embrace it is that it is so efficient. We get a lot done. And what we know is like everything we're doing has some kind of purpose. It may take longer with some kids, and we may need to backtrack with some kids, but it's very, very efficient. And that was certainly drilled into us working with Zig out in the practica for sure. I mean, transition between lessons, he just like, even that, if you waste 5 minutes between transitions from group to group after 5 days, that's 25 minutes. That's a whole instructional group. You've just thrown away a whole day. So yeah, that was burned into be efficient, keep it going, but keep the kids engaged too. I mean, Zig, when he taught kids, it was joyous and fun and silly and joking, but that was all woven into the instruction. It wasn't, people look at those scripts and just think, oh, it's just the kids are just barking out answers and it's just dry and mean. It is absolutely the opposite of that. And if anybody ever goes and looks at those videos of Zig working with kids, that's how he was with kids all the time. It was, if this isn't going to be fun, let's not even bother doing it. So lots of fun, lots of energy, lots of engagement, but efficient. You're doing purposeful, efficient instruction all the time.
I love it. It's just a different way. It's a different way of running a school program. It's a different culture that we have to develop around, people just don't like the idea of efficiency. They talk about it's like schools are like McDonald's or something. And I just want to explain, like, look, this is their first and only shot at this, right? We have to give them, we have to make their time worthwhile. We have to honor their time. I did want to ask you about another thing that you're well known for. You've told me, like, people bring this up, like, oh, I just realized, like, oh, that was you, and that was the Hasbrouck and Tyndall norms.
Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe speak to those?
Well, I would be delighted to. And in that talk that I gave, Zach, Jerry Tyndall, who is the Tyndall of Hasbrouck and Tyndall, he definitely got a shout out too, because he was one of my teachers at the University of Oregon. Again, I kind of got stuck there for my learning, but that turned out really well for me. I encountered Jerry at a time when my job, I was out in the field. I had gotten my master's with Zig and was out in the in the local community there. I taught in Springfield, Oregon. My first job was in Brownsville and Shedd and Halsey. Actually, I was an itinerant reading teacher up in Central Lynn. And then I wanted to work closer to home, so I worked in the Springfield School District, but I was working as a reading specialist. And then my boss at the time had this idea that he would like me, instead of working with children, to work with teachers. He didn't use the term coach, but that is what I know now, that he had this vision in mind that I would be the instructional coach. And I found out right away that it's a real different job. And just like when I was 19 years old and trying to figure out how do I be a teacher, I really wanted to figure out how do you be a coach? Surely somebody should know something about this. And it so happened that this then young, brand new professor named Jerry Tyndall, who had just graduated from the University of Minnesota, was teaching courses over at the campus near my house, the University of Oregon. He was teaching courses on consultation, where school professionals would work with other school professionals to improve outcomes for students. Like, that sounds like what I'm doing. So I started taking courses from Jerry and found out right away that in his interpretation of consultation, it was all data-driven problem solving. That's how he approached it. And the data that he wanted us all to use was coming from this brand new set of assessments called CBM, curriculum-based measures, because he had just graduated from the University of Minnesota, along with Mark Shin, who was also just arrived at the University of Oregon. And they were part of the team that invented these things. So we learned about oral reading fluency. We learned about different curriculum-based measures of writing and spelling and the Maze assessment. And that was what we were learning, and how to administer them, and then use that data to inform our consultation or coaching with our colleagues. Well, that's where I heard from Jerry Tyndall about this weird little measure called oral reading fluency, where they thought that a 1 minute assessment could give us good information. And that's where I was like, nope. I don't buy it. I don't believe it. But I went out and tried it with my students, and that worked. The problem was, in those days, the early days, before DIBELS, before Easy CBM or AIMS-Web or anything, there was simply a protocol. You found a book that was at your kid's grade level, supposedly, and had them read, and you would get a score using this standardized protocol. But how did you interpret that score? Well, the University of Minnesota people, Jerry Tyndall and others, said, well, what you do is you've got to create norms. So that's how you interpret it. And they said, what you should do is have all the kids in your school read the same passage, and then you can create school-based norms. Well, I thought that was also ridiculous. I thought the whole ORF thing was ridiculous, but I thought school-based norms was ridiculous, in part because all my work as a reading specialist in Central Lynn and Springfield, I was a Title I teacher. I worked at high poverty, low performing schools. And I thought, I don't want to know what the average is of my high poverty, low performing kids. I want to know what the national standard should be. I told Jerry that, and he said he thought that was a good idea. So he found a little cubicle for me and brought me boxes and boxes and boxes of dusty, old computer printouts. We found ultimately 10,000 scores of oral reading fluency way back. This is in the late 80s. And I used those with Jerry's help to create the first set of oral reading fluency norms. We subsequently did 2 other studies. The second one was in 2006 with 250,000 students. And our most recent one, 2017, was 6 million students. But the whole purpose of those, even though now there is DIBELS and AIMS-Web and all of those that have their own norms, those are only applicable when you use their passages. So it still has benefit to teachers who don't either have access to those, or they simply want to know what their seventh grader or their fifth grader, where do they stand compared to their age peers? And that's what the current versions, or all the versions of the Hasbrouck and Tyndall norms, are generic oral reading fluency norms that you can use alongside of your Dibbles norms, your Ames-Webb norms, or your ECCBM norms, or you could use them. You just want to see how students are doing in their social studies, their grade level social studies book, or their history book, or their English language arts book, or something like that. So that's been a contribution to the reading world that has been widely embraced in, it seems, all English-speaking countries for sure. I hear nearly daily, but certainly weekly, from people around the world who are using our norms in their research or in their classroom practices.
And could you give us some examples of like those norms, like specifically like what? Because it's a generic process, like you said, that could be used for any text.
Yeah.
Like, maybe parents are listening in, or teachers who are wanting to explore these. Like, what would they be getting into if they dug into these norms?
Well, what the norms are, I mean, most people have seen a version of the norms that's actually, they refer to it as a chart. It's a little chart that has grade levels. So our norms the last two studies start with first grade. Our second study in 2006 went up through eighth grade. And then our most recent one was first grade through sixth grade. And they're all organized around beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year. And then there are numeric values, words correct per minute, assigned to various percentiles. So there's always, and the way we've always reported it is the 90th percentile, the 75th, the 50th, the 25th, and the 10th percentile. And where we're always hoping students would be at least at the 50th percentile, and perhaps some students reading a little higher than that, up to the 75th percentile. That's the best, most current research we have that suggests that the 50th percentile is necessary, again, for comprehension. This is always about comprehension. And that the 75th percentile is where we hit the maximum value for comprehension. Although there are children, we have documented that, there are children who read at a rate or a level of automaticity that ranks them at the 90th percentile. There's no evidence that those kids are better comprehenders. Comprehension sweet spot is the 50th to the 75th. So if you're a parent and your student is bringing home materials, so let's say a third grade, and you would have to make some kind of assumption that those materials are probably grade level materials. It could be a novel that the children are reading in their class, or it could be, again, their social studies book or a history book or something like that. You would have the student read aloud from a piece they hadn't previously practiced for 1 minute. And then there's a scoring procedure, and you can look this up. The internet is filled with curriculum-based measure or oral reading fluency guidelines. And it will tell you how to score those things. If they skip the word, that's an error. If they mispronounce the word is treasure and they say tomorrow or whatever, that's a mistake. If they get stuck on a word, you only let them stay stuck for 3 seconds, about 3 seconds, and then you tell them the word, and that's an error. So at the end of the 60 seconds, you take all their errors and subtract it. They may have read 83 words, and let's say they made 3 errors. Make it easy. So their score then is 80 words correct per minute. And if this is a third grader and it's the middle of the year, then we would go to the Hasbrouck and Tyndall chart for third grade and look, where does 80 fit on this? And I sort of made all that up, but I'm looking at my chart right now. In middle of the year, on our most recent study, the 25th percentile on our chart is 79. And that would be, it's always rounding up and down a little bit. So 80 would put that child at the 25th percentile, which is significantly lower in terms of their automaticity or their fluency than we would want them to be. So if I saw that, and I would rarely, especially a parent at home, just randomly picking a passage, I would want to do this a couple more times. Let's try a different passage. Let's try something different, because what we want to see is sort of a pattern: 85, 76. If you get consistent numbers like that, then we can be pretty sure that that student is lower than they should be on this measure of fluency. And that's a concern. And that would be worthy of a conversation with the classroom teacher. Like, have you noticed this? And what are you doing about it? But classroom teachers can do the same. I just did a training last week in Florida, and many of the people in my audience were not reading teachers, but they just taught subject matter. And you could take I was saying to the teachers, you can take your biology text and pick a passage and have the students read it and compare it to. For older students, we're always looking for by the end of the year about 150 words correct per minute. So even if our charts don't go up that high, you can still, the rates tend to level out actually around fifth grade. At the end of fifth grade, kids are generally getting, in the 6 million kids we looked at, about 150 on average. So that stays true for fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade. Tim Rosinski has done some research with college students and high school students. 150 is the number that always comes out. And that's the 50th percentile. So that's kind of minimum. We would like them to be a little bit more automatic than that for full access to comprehension.
I love that. That was such a good description. Thank you. I love you even pulled out the chart and like actually did us an example. That was awesome.
I have to pull out the chart because I have not memorized it.
That's great. Well, I'll put some links to that in the show notes for people that are interested. This is sort of our last question, and it's around Read Washington. You're the co-founder of Read Washington. That's correct, right? How do you envision the future of professional development for teachers, sort of and educators in the context of the science of reading? As we kind of started this off talking about, it's time, the stuff's evolving, we're moving pretty quickly, we're at a different phase maybe in the science of reading movement. What do you envision in terms of sort of next steps?
Well, thank you for mentioning Read Washington. It is a little group of us here in Seattle, although we just added a board member who is looking to relocate to Spokane, Washington. So we're getting a more east-west representation. But the purpose of Read Washington, we are all educators, and our purpose is to connect teachers through professional development to best practices based on scientific evidence. So I would hope that you would put a little link to Read Washington in there as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We just had a board meeting actually yesterday for Read Washington, and we did talk about the future of professional development. One of the things that we've been doing since our founding, which was just a couple of years before COVID, is we started doing in person, because that's the way we did professional development in those days. You have people come together in a room and you have somebody present, and hopefully it's a good high quality presentation and the people actually learn something and they can benefit from that. Post-COVID, we switched, like so many people did, to online webinars and found a huge benefit to that, which was we have had webinars where we have people from 31 countries attending, rather than people who could get on a ferry and come over to Seattle in the morning. There's a benefit, is online connections with each other. So we can definitely expand that. And I think a lot of people, I spent this morning, Zach, before I started talking to you, I watched a lecture from Stanislas Dewan, the cognitive neuroscientist, talking about how the brain learns. So he was, presenting a conference that was recorded, and I got to see that. So the internet has changed how we can access some of the best information. But the real future has always been, how do we take this good information and effectively use it in the classroom? The true future, if we're going to change not just minds, but change practice, is going to be coaching. And that's not new. I mean, I'm thinking instantly back where we started this conversation. I'm thinking about my 19-year-old self going out to driving in the rain in my pickup truck to my practicum, where I was handed a direct instruction manual and somebody watched me teach, not every single day, but that was part of the training we got. Zig would come out to the school, or his trainers would watch us teach and stop us and come and teach beside us and coach us and model and explain the why. But also show us how to do it, give us feedback. Now you got it. That's right. That's the right pace. Oh, you missed that error. You need to do a correction. Go back and do those kinds of things. So it's not new, but it is the real missing piece in a lot of professional development, is that in-person support from somebody who can give you that on-the-spot feedback and guidance about how do you take all this wonderful information and make it work with this group of children who are in front of you.
I am so glad you said that. This has been in my mind, and I have not had anyone to say it to, which is that what people don't understand about project follow through, because I'm learning about this, you can only read so much, but I'm learning about it stuff all the time. But what I only recently realized was that the Distar folks who put this together were way ahead of the game when it came to implementation science. Like, they had a sophisticated theory for how to put this into place. And anybody who's, because I'm into the coaching space, everybody here knows that people that criticize the coaching world give all these things that they don't like. And they even will say it's so undefined, it's so new and all this. I'm going, they had coaches and project follow through that were doing this with videotapes. You know what I mean? It's pretty crazy, actually.
Oh yeah. When you said videotapes, when I worked, I was supervising students, DI students. Once I moved into the master's program, part of Project Follow Through, I would fly around the country, but I also locally took over the supervision role in some of the classes. And I had a little Volkswagen Beetle at the time, and the video equipment that we had to schlep out to the school was like 80 pounds of these huge things that I had to cram into. Now we could just take our phone and do videotaping, but yeah, videotaping was a good part of it. We would video, we would watch with our students, we would give them feedback in person, live, but also videotaping so we could do it later. Yeah, it was, and that was 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I love that you said that. I also agree. Jan, I feel like we could talk for forever. I'm just so glad. I know you were a little sick on our first recording, so it's so glad to hear you've recovered. and you're welcome back on the show anytime. I want to keep this conversation going for folks. Can you maybe spend this last little bit just kind of letting people know what you've been writing lately, where they can find you, what kind of contact stuff they can do?
Oh, well, thank you for that opportunity. I do live in Seattle, Washington. I live here in part because both of my kids, who were born and raised in Eugene, Oregon, moved up here to go to the University of Washington, those traitors, but I love them. And so I moved up here to be with them too. So I'm in Seattle, Washington. I work now primarily as a private consultant. So I'm still traveling around the country. Next week, I'll be in Ohio working with some teachers. And that's great, fun work. I love continuing to do that. I am still involved in some research projects. Jerry Tyndall, who's still at the University of Oregon, and I are working on a project together. I'm part of a research team with folks in Australia at La Trobe University, Pamela Snow and others. We're looking at coaching model. But most recently, I've written a few books. I've written a book on fluency with Deb Glazer. I wrote a book called Conquering Dyslexia about my own journey as a parent with a child with dyslexia and best practices from evidence. I've written a book on coaching called Student Focused Coaching with Daryl Mickle. My most recent book, I'm just going to hold this up. I know we're not on camera here, but this is a book just came out this year, 2024, called Climbing the Ladder of Reading and Writing, Meeting the Needs of All Learners. This is a co-edited book. I edited this with Nancy Young, who's Canadian. And it is a book. It is a book based on her infographic, a framework for education that shows that learning to read and write is like a process, like climbing a ladder, and that there are children who have different levels of ease, the way their brains function. Climbing that ladder is going to be super easy, or it's going to be just like a normal kind of pathway, or it's going to be a real struggle. And this book is all about explaining that process. How do children learn to read? What are the best evidence-based practices? And what are the specific interventions or instructional considerations that we need to make for children with different levels of challenges? We have a chapter on gifted advanced readers. We have a chapter on ADHD. We have a chapter on children with language difficulties, developmental language disorder, older students who still struggle. I wrote a chapter on dyslexia, and it's written for parents and novice teachers. It's meant to be sort of an overview of the science of reading and the instructional implications. So we've gotten tremendously wonderful reviews of it. A lot of professors are actually using it in their coursework with their students. So eager to have more people take a look at that book, because I think it's very helpful. I'm very proud of that book.
Excellent. Well, I will put a link to that in the show notes. Folks, we've come to the end of our show today. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to this podcast. I'll keep on putting these out there as I have the time, but I really appreciate all of your support. If you could spread it around, give it a 5-star rating and so on, send it to a principal who's confused and needs to listen to this. I really appreciate that. Jan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
You're very welcome, Zach. It was a joy.
Take care.